Hello, viewers. Welcome back to the Mack Truck Book Stop, where we're going to continue the Reading the World series today with Flights by Olga Tokarczuk. Tokarczuk. I don't know. Can't really pronounce Polish that well, but this is the book I'm talking about today from Poland, and it was a fantastic read for sure. A Nobel Prize in literature. It was written, I believe, in 2007 or 6. I'll look that up and put it, of course, on the video as usual, or published, I should say. And it was quite a different read from the last book, which is great. And I liked it for in very different ways. And this is a very non-traditional novel. It's not a kind of a linear story from A to B as the the last book I read, but it's almost kind of a collection of loosely interconnected short stories around very similar themes of movement, anatomy, travel, um, obsession, uh, you could say perspective, um, and all these themes are kind of what connect the stories, and they are um, kind of in between these stories are short little vignettes or thoughts, kind of random journal entries, almost you could call them, from a woman on travel that's traveling around and in airports and metro stations, and it's kind of like they feel like diary entries, like possibly autobiographical, like things that came straight out of the author's diary is what they feel like. So that's the gist of what the book does. In terms of kind of where it's coming from, if there's anything about the book or what you read about the author that might scare you, say politically, I felt like the novel is something that somebody from any political or ideological perspective can actually find something in. There was one interview with the author where she's felt that it's kind of like a Rorschach test. So the book is, by being very non-linear and not trying to really say any particular thing, but saying a lot of different things in different ways, allows you to find something of meaning in it and project kind of your own thoughts into it. So I can talk a little bit more about what I personally found in it. And if I had to say, like, this is what I think the book is saying, I do have an opinion on that. But I want to, I guess, not sell the book, but say I really liked it and would encourage somebody to read it, because there's a lot of different ways you can interpret this book, and it will mean different things to different people, which is a great thing. And in some ways, I would consider this book to be like the closest thing that I've ever read to a modern novel feeling like a classic literature read. Like, this feels like a classic when you read it, but it mentions things like Wikipedia and stuff that you'd never find in the classics, so to speak, that were written pre 2000, which this one, as far as I know at the moment, this is the deepest and most compelling post 2000 book that exists. For me, it's certainly one of the best I've read. Um, and it took a while to convince me, I'm going to be honest, because about halfway through the book, there were a lot of things I found interesting, but then some of the short stories, it's like I didn't really know where they were going, and there were a lot of these detailed descriptions of, like, anatomy, especially. If you're like particularly interested or obsessed with anatomy and descriptions of, like, the human body and its inner workings, you're gonna love this book. Also, but then at the same time, even though it's got these really detailed descriptions of anatomy, it's also got these kind of wide, bird's eye philosophies of travel and of how humans society is and how it develops. Um, Actually, there is a quote that I can share. Um, there's a particular, I guess, story in the book called, or short chapter in the book called Frog and Bird, which states there are only two points of view in the world: the frog's perspective and bird's eye view. Any point in between just leads to chaos. That is actually kind of a good description of what this book is like. It suddenly shifts between big perspectives of descriptions of like the sociology or the psychology of airports and travel, and then to like these very these short stories that include very detailed descriptions and events around the human body and anatomy. And the book kind of tries to draw parallels between these very different things. And you're, I guess, halfway through the book, I'm like kind of in confusion of where this is going, but I felt that the end really crescendoed and and brought forth this the struggle that's at the heart of the book, which is actually change versus permanence. Um, like early on in the book, it talks about island psychology, right? Which is which this is the or very early in the book. There's a short story where a man's reality kind of falls apart on an island. His wife and son just kind of disappear into nowhere, and then shortly after that, there's a chapter that talks about island psychology, where everything is complete in itself. That it is the representation of people at our most primitive state. Narcissism and autism are mentioned in that section, and there, at the heart of the book, there is this struggle between the chaos of, not even chaos, but just movement. What does movement mean? And then God in the book is almost defined as like what is static, but there's also kind of sort of a pushback against that, movement is the only thing in life that is meaningful, change and movement. But then at the same time, there's this the things we consider most spiritual are like supposed to be static and unchangeable. So that's the major tension of the book, and the major ideas behind it. Describing specific things, there's stuff in like the 1600s. There's short stories in like the 1700s of like anatomists, biologists. It's all over Europe. There's some sections that even go into like East Asia. It's kind of all over the world, but mostly in Europe, that these different stories take place. There's a lot of descriptions of the seasons, winter, some different cities in Europe, some very beautiful landscape descriptions as well. There's a lot going on in this book, and this is one that I know I'm going to read again at some point and do a deep read on, because, as I said, I think there's a lot that you can get into in this book. And even though the author calls it a Rorschach test, I think there is something at the heart of it that can be unraveled, whether the author's aware of it or not. And I think it's worth another read at some point, because there's also a lot of references. There's a lot of allusions to other literature. Borges is mentioned. What else? Kafka again. Gregor Samsa is mentioned. I noticed these are like recurring things that are mentioned in a lot of the books that I'm reading just accidentally, and these are authors that Kafka I'd never read before doing this project, and Borges I read recently. So it's so cool to see how all these books are kind of interconnecting. So anyway, with that, I just want to say I do recommend Flights as like a real exploration of what stability and change mean to you as a person, and what do they mean to us, our societies and people. How does movement, what is movement and what is stability, what is chaos and what is entropy, and this all sounds really abstract, but it's told in very specific philosophies about life. There's so many small stories that I could read. Like, I don't know, I want to see, like, she calls, there's a short section on Wikipedia where the author or the narrator, I guess, calls it mankind's most honest cognitive project, and then goes on for like 2 paragraphs talking about that. There was the frog and bird perspective I mentioned before. Throughout the book, there's like these maps. There's a few maps interspersed throughout, and I didn't realize till the end of the book that there's actually an index in the back that tells you what the maps are, because some of them I didn't know. And they all do actually relate to something in the reading. I didn't realize it at first, but some of them were harder to connect than others, but they're not always connecting right to the very page that you find them on. But I do think that they are particularly and specifically placed on purpose, and you can draw your own conclusions on that. I've been sitting here talking, and I haven't even mentioned the flights that I have here on the table, because the book is called Flights, but I decided as part of this video I was going to prepare an actual flight with some random beers I found at the grocery store. I've now finished the non-spoiler section, by the way, so as I'm pouring these flights, if this book sounds interesting to you, this kind of like rumination, philosophy, and divided by these shorter stories that are interconnected around these themes that I discussed. There's a lot more I could say, but I think it's just worth the read. As I said, I felt like it was a modern novel, but it really, when you read it, it feels like classic literature, and I believe it is definitely deserving of the Nobel Prize. Olga Tokarczuk, if I'm pronouncing that right, is an awesome writer, a really awesome writer, and even my partner here, I read her a few of the short stories in the book, or short chapters, and she was impressed as well. So I definitely recommend it. I just want to say some of these beers. So I've got Candy Crushable. I don't know what that is. We've got Freedom of Speech, and I'm actually kind of making a mess as I'm pouring them here. This is a peach one. And then I've got a Plaid Jacket Pilsner. Apparently I don't know how to pour flights. Getting better as we go. Honestly, I don't plan on spoiling too much of the novel, so even if you want to stick around and enjoy these flights with me, it's probably not a big deal, because this novel is actually, it's like so philosophical that I feel like even if you know what happens, it's not a big deal. And I say that about a lot of books, but I mean it. I guess that's just the kind of books that I end up picking for this project. Another thing I thought was cool is there's actually a chapter near the end of the book called On the Origin of Species, and that was actually the name of the one I read from South Korea just 2 books ago, which of course is a reference to Darwin's On the Origin of Species, but it actually, that chapter seemed like it was a story out of that book, and it was just crazy, like this interconnection that I just got the chills. And that story was talking about like how plastic bags are their own species and are like taking over the world and stuff. So that was interesting. I just gotta top these off a bit. So, yeah. And the peach. All right, this is actually the first time I've ever used this flight, which was a gift for my wedding. My sister's wedding as a because I was a groomsman at my sister's wedding. But today I was confused because today is actually my wedding anniversary. So anyway, back to the book. For our first drink, this is the Candy Crushable. Oh boy. Cheers, yeah. Not bad. I expected it to be sweeter, honestly. But, anyway, the themes that emerged to me as I was reading this novel. So, as I mentioned, at about the halfway point, 200 pages in, it's like, I hadn't have drawn out themes emerging till now. So I mentioned travel, movement, airports, psychology. I loved certain parts of the novel that, for example, described airports as like cities, and there's one chapter in particular that described airports as this new type of city emerging. The book has some really fresh perspectives on what the modern world is becoming. It makes you think about these things. And by using distorted perspectives that are not from our typical point of view. So that chapter I mentioned that says that the frog and the bird, those are the only two perspectives worth anything, because any point in between is chaos. Well, we are a point in between, and I guess humanity is chaos. I don't know if that really makes sense, but what I like about using the bird's eye view and the frog's point of view is that those are the point of views that give us perspective on ourselves. Because if you just stay in our perspective, then that's our day to day. Why read a book? Well, to get into somebody else's head, right? So these short vignettes, like the bird and the frog, are kind of these sweeping philosophies, brainstorming. There's a lot of chapters that, again, as I mentioned, that deal with the anatomy. There's one I particularly enjoyed. Like a main story in the book was about a doctor and professor who devoted his life to studying phantom pain because he was an amputee when he was younger. And he actually requested to keep his leg in formaldehyde. So he keeps his leg in formaldehyde, and he's feeling this phantom pain, like the leg is still there. And he devotes his life to studying this. And this idea of the phantom pain, just like everything else anatomy related in the book, ends up getting compared at some point in the book to something psychological or something about humans and society in general. And I'll get to that in a moment. He determines that his phantom pain, the phantom pain of his amputated leg, his limb, is God. Even though he's taken apart and analyzed every piece and fiber of his amputated leg, he determines that it's the phantom pain, the thing that does not exist, but that seems to be permanent and yet ephemeral, is God, the unchangeable thing, the invisible thing. You can take apart and analyze every part of travel and movement, as the narrator in this book does, the narrator that exists between these short stories that relate to anatomy and psychology. You can take apart and analyze every part of travel and movement, and yet it is this phantom and invisible and possibly non-existent idea of stability and home that we all have, which is God. And that is if we take the anatomical stories to represent the psychology of the narrator that is between those stories, which I do. Themes that emerge in the second half of the book. But first, let me continue, and I believe this one is the peach. Freedom of speech. Peach, get it? It's a play on words like flights and flights. That's not a play on words at all. I've already had a few before this video anyway. So preservation and reproduction are themes that emerge in the second part of the book. Writing words is, as is stated in the final chapter of the book, like placing each other and what we observe in formaldehyde. Words are placed in a novel like formaldehyde. Clarity, movement, or change, movement. There's another, I guess the final main story that I really liked is about a professor who's married to a woman about 20 years younger than him, and even in his final years, he could be retired, but he still, takes these students, tourists, anyone who wants to, on these long boat cruises around the Mediterranean, and talks about Greek history and culture and archaeology, the gods. He's basically the most intelligent person, or the most knowledgeable person about ancient Greece that exists. And there's a mention of a very obscure Greek god who is the god of things that the word actually means things happening at just the right time, or something to that effect. And this god is kind of the god of that, like of oh, this perfect thing happened in the right time. And I can't remember exactly what the Greek word was, but that's the allusion to another part of the book. But then there's this sudden boat crash, and once again, it's like whenever things in this book get too heady and philosophical, another chapter or another part comes along. And this is the first time I feel like it happens in the same exact chapter. Something physical and real, anatomical happens. So in this boat crash, the professor ends up basically dying of a stroke, and there's this description of his brain and all his knowledge filling with blood. These are kind of just the weird descriptions of the book, but yeah, that's kind of this book just always is writing a tension between the anatomical and the psychological. And then I'm gonna, let's see, have this what's the next one? The Play Jacket Pilsner. All right. So I'm trying to, like, a lot of personal feelings came up during the book, and I'm trying to get to those. So far, I feel like I've just stayed talking about the philosophical things, but there were a lot of things in the book that made me think of things that I'd experienced in my life. There was one discussion of ichthyologists talking about basically fabricating evidence of fish being created by God rather than evolution. And the narrator asks, well, why create this evidence? And the answer was something to the effect of, well, for the ichthyologist, for the fish that they study, it's the water is God and the ichthyologists are God. But it was said much better than that. It made me think of an ichthyology class I took in high school, and I remember the teacher being religious, and I was thinking of that. And this book has a lot of intersections between science and religion. I don't feel that the book takes any stand against religion. I think there's a lot of exploration of what God could mean and what God could be. Does God mean movement, or does God mean entropy, or does God mean where is that to be found? Like, for example, Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler refers to change as God. This book almost, for much of it, takes the opposite perspective of that. It is the unchanging that is God. It is entropy that's God. and movement is kind of an illusion against that. Or, and it does consider the opposite, where that which is unchanging does not exist, but yet it's powerful, like phantom pain. I have also been listening to some literature podcasts and things, and I find one thing I've heard a couple times is that looking at the first and last lines of the book can be interesting. So this is the first book I've tried that with. Here I am are the first lines of the book, if you count the chapter title, which are not repeated after that, so I do. They aren't really chapters, there's just bold letters that signify new parts of the book starting, like titles of journal entries, but they're not numbered. The last line, so the first line is, here I am. Present moment. There's a lot of talk about traveling. When you're traveling, you kind of eventually reduce yourself to the present moment, forgetting, and you get over the fear of waking up, like, where am I? What am I doing? And you shift to, here I am. That's where the narrator is at the beginning of this novel. The last line, before I talk about the last line, we're going to try the sparkle slushy. Yeah. Ooh, wow. Ale exploding with mango, guava, pomegranate, cherry, and strawberry. That's what this one is. That's they were gonna charge me $18 for that one. No, it was like, well, it is good, but no, it was ringing up as a 4-pack, but it was just one. So long story. Anyway, last line of the book. That smile of theirs holds, or so it strikes us. Oh wait, sorry. They're talking about the flight attendants as some people are getting on the plane. That smile of theirs holds, or so it strikes us, a kind of promise that perhaps we will be born anew now, this time in the right time and the right place. So we've moved from here I am to something, to longing for something, a right time in a right place. That obscure Greek god of that right thing happening at the right time. This book isn't, the characters aren't seeking happiness. Most of them are seeking a particular objective. There's another of the main stories of the book. Well, let's take two of the main stories of the book. One is about a man trying to figure out why his wife and son suddenly disappeared. They come back, but he's trying to figure out why. Another one is about Chopin's sister who wants to take his heart back to Warsaw. The characters in this book they want a specific thing that has to do with a change or a movement, or in the case of Chopin, a longing for home. I'm finally getting to after almost 30 minutes, and a few beers, I'm finally getting to, I think, the feelings that why this book was powerful to me. How would I describe this book emotionally? Emotionally, I felt through most of it, and like an anxiety, not anxiety, like a discontent, a feeling of never being able to be happy in one place. That theme of traveling from place to place, or this feeling of instability, of being lost, and the most moving moments of the book are when there was something to hold on to. For example, the professor's love of Greek history and literature, and history and architecture and archaeology, and he gives this powerful, moving speech at one point about how time, when you think of a time of history, time is not. There's always this reference to a panopticon. A panopticon is like often was used to describe prisons. Um, and in many parts of the book talk about or make an analogy about a panopticon, where it's this form of a prison that you can look inward and you can see all of the cells basically from wherever you are in the prison. So it's like it's this sort of like I don't know if you want to say condensing of a whole world into kind of a viewable, uh, a lot of things into a viewable shape, where you can see all parts of the shape. At least that's what I understood of it. But um, this idea of the panopticon is related, but this professor gives a moving speech about how it's really not like that. We aren't looking down into history at a specific place in it. All moments in history are their own expansive now. Just like at the beginning of the book when the author says, "Here I am," and the idea of looking for the right thing to happen in the right time in the right place is a deep illusion. Um, and there is a lot of struggle in the book. I feel that I feel like there's an unhappiness and a discontent at the heart of the book of somebody who can't find a home. It represents a world that is losing its traditions. It represents a globalizing world, especially considering this was written in 2000, like the mid 2000 to 2010, like 2006 or 7 is when it was published. So keeping that in mind, like that's when globalization was really kicking off. I think now you could argue we're seeing some of it recede, but uh, it's regardless, we're facing a world that where a lot of like stability and traditions in our lives are being done away with and being replaced with this newfound freedom. And flights, in many ways, takes the idea of this freedom to its furthest conclusions and shows how our reality is kind of disintegrating because of this, and that we have to find new ways to describe time and space um, in this new generation. Exploding with mango, guava, pomegranate, cherry, and strawberry. The drink, that is, not our generation. I hope. All right, last one, and I can wrap up this video. The Ugly Finder IPA. Yeah, so there's so much. I really don't feel that I've come to any great conclusion in this video. This is a very fresh take on the book because I just finished it today, and I still have so many questions left. But that's the sign of a good book, I think, is that it makes you ask questions. It makes you want to go back into it and figure out like what are all these references that I didn't understand. But at the same time, you don't have to understand the references to get the themes and get the idea and start asking yourself the questions that the book is asking. But I think the references would lead to clues about what the author was trying to present and, what's behind those themes. So again, as I say, I definitely will read it again. And I do recommend it. I also want to mention that the next book I'm going to read, for anyone who is interested in getting ahead and reading it, this was actually recommended to me by a viewer, new subscriber, and it's going to be Gabriel Garcia Marquez Del Amor y Otros Demonios, or in English, I believe it's, what is it in English? Love and Other Demons, I think. I don't know. I'm reading it in Spanish because I'm fluent in Spanish, so I might as well read it in the original language. I had debated doing 100 Years of Solitude, but that is a big book, and this one seemed a little bit more digestible as an entry to Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So Where you got, yep, Of Love and Other Demons. You can find it in English if English is your preferred language to read it. So Of Love and Other Demons by Gabriel Garcia Marquez will be the next book. And once again, Flights by Olga Tokarczuk. Thank you all for watching, and have a blessed week, and we will see you in the next video.